Today, I'm speaking with Evelynn Combs and Dr. Gerad Smith. Evelynn is a trained archaeologist and tribal administrator for the Healy Lake Tribal Council, an indigenous Alaskan community in which she was born and raised. Dr. Gerad Smith, who was featured on this podcast before, is an archaeologist specializing in the history of the Dene people of interior Alaska and the Canadian subarctic. The three of us are discussing Gerad and Evelynn's experimental archaeology work, their attempts to reconstruct methods of ancient Dene copper working, and to understand its role in Dene stories and culture. My name is Sebastian Weatherby, and this is The Tell. Hey Evelynn. Hey Gerad. Thanks for taking the time. Precolonial metalworking in ancient North America it's not exactly a popular topic in world history. And so I wanted to start by asking both of you how you got interested in the subject. Maybe, Evelynn, do you wanna start? Just lay out what led you into this?
When I was little, what sparked it very, very initially was my uncles were building a steam bath, and we had all the volcanic rocks. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't fathom how hot inside the fire it was getting. And then one of my uncles mentioned, oh yeah, if you threw metal in there, it'd melt. And that just stuck in my brain because these lava rocks get so hot and we pour steam on them, and that's where the steam bath comes from. And so when I was like 12 or 13, my uncle and my mom gave me my own cabin. And at that point I was like, I'm completely unmonitored. There's nobody here telling me not to do this. And so I fired up my wood stove and I just started casting bullets because I was really interested in creating bullets and developing new types of bullets with different metals and in combination with things like obsidian.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and so I almost burnt my cabin down that first time because I almost melted my stove. And so I was like, all right, time to actually learn about this. It's very dangerous. So I spent the next couple of years doing a lot of reading and a lot of experimenting at home between my wood stove and a fire pit outside, just mixing metals with stone and different types of casting sets. Mm-hmm. And then at some point around that time, my Uncle Fred had mentioned that we traditionally did copper work as a people, and we used to trade with the Copper River people. We would give them red ochre, among other things, and this ochre was very highly valued, and so when we would trade them this ochre, they would trade back to us the copper, which was also very precious. And so I've always just been really interested in the way metal works.
And that area along the Copper River, I guess sort of in the Wrangell, St. Elias mountains, and I guess centered around the Atna people, right? That isn't just an area of metalworking, but is sort of one of the primary, what would you say, hearts of indigenous metalworking in North America, right?
They're very rich people, yeah.
What do we know about the age of that and its connection to other metalworking traditions in North America?
There's sort of, as we understand it, there's about 3 different centers of copper working in North America, excluding Mexico. And we won't get into Mexico or South America. That's a totally different ballgame. There's the copper from the Great Lakes region, and that's found throughout the United States in the archaeological record. And that goes back pretty far. And I'm not as familiar with the literature on that, so I won't try to guesstimate ages because I could be easily wrong. There's 2 spots up here in the north. One is here in Alaska and Yukon, and the Alaskan and British Columbian coasts with the Tlingit traditional lands. And the other place has to do with what's called the Copper Inuit in north central Canada. And they're interesting because they had a native copper industry, but at the same time they were also trading for manufactured copper from the Vikings in Greenland. So with archaeologists that are working in north central Arctic Canada, which there is not a lot. So it's some of this literature is pretty old. They have to distinguish between native copper and manufactured sheep copper that's being traded with the Vikings 1,000 years ago, and that goes on for about 200 years, that trade with the Vikings and bringing copper in. So that's pretty interesting. We don't really know if there's any connection between that and the copper industry here in Alaska.
What's going on in Alaska?
There was definitely trade networks going back and forth, and who knows what, there's no copper coming in from that area that we know of, but, there could have been ideas. Copper artifacts enter the Alaskan record about 1,500 years ago, maybe a little bit earlier than that, but after about 1,000 years ago, they start to get kind of popular. But copper was a prestige item, far more expensive than it is today. So with such an expensive item, you were not likely to lose it ever. So I often wonder, how long was copper being carried around and worked with by, indigenous Dene here before someone finally got around to losing a piece and it entering into the archaeological record. But yeah, I think Bree, Dr. Doring, found some of the oldest copper in the archaeological record for the Tanana Valley at Quartz Lake, and that was about 1,000 years old.
Wow. That's Brianna Doring from now the University of Wyoming. And so I imagine that also, as a prestige item, the knowledge and tradition of exactly how to produce it must be a pretty important thing to pass down generation to generation, right? I'm sure it has probably a really important role in stories and oral tradition, right?
Right. Yeah, I think, Dr. Corey Cooper, he's done a lot of studies, most of the anthropological studies on copper here in the interior. And he discusses how the knowledge of copper was passed down through almost a copper shaman. It was considered to be a sort of magical trade, and these persons who had that knowledge had to isolate themselves away from the tribe, especially when they were working with the copper. And Evie could probably talk a little bit more about the importance of this, but when you're engaging with an external powerful power source, if you did not know how to interact with it properly, or you yourself might not be powerful enough or in the right mindset enough to interact with it, it becomes has a toxic effect on you and those around you. And so then they would pass that knowledge on to their apprentices, who may or may not be family members.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, there is sort of a familial element to that.
Yeah. And then too, before I talk about that, one interesting thing about the timelines that I've always really liked is copper also has a decay rate. So how much copper are we not seeing in the record because it simply is rotted? So one thing that I personally would like to research in the future is copper residue in hearths, because copper does leave a residue.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and it's so in charge of where it's at, essentially, that if I were to introduce copper into my forge, I would not be able to appropriately or completely forge weld any other metal after that. And forge welding is welding. It's just the act of using a forge to do the welding instead of like a TIG or a oxyacetylene setup.
But so you have to have a copper forge.
Yes.
It can't just be your forge.
Yeah. And that's not saying you can't forge in something after you use copper. It's just like anything beyond very basic smith work you're not going to be able to accomplish. Yeah. Because that copper has totally contaminated your forge. Huh. But for the shaman part of it, Gerad's right on point. Really, that was a really good way to lay out this terminology without me having to spiritually risk myself by saying anything that I shouldn't.
Yeah.
But basically, with a lot of these Athabascan practices, they fall under what we call Hutlani, which is just the way we believe. It's our belief system, essentially. And
it means the right way to do things.
Yeah, and the wrong way to do things is NG. So, like, if I stepped over you, that would be NG. That would be bad luck. So that's an example of something that's just NG. That's how we refer to it.
Yeah.
Don't do it. So, like, a lot of these traditions, I believe, are dying out because what Gerad said is correct, is you have to be properly trained and you have to be, like, in a spiritual sense, clean. You have to be in the right mindset. You had to have had preparation time mentally and emotionally, what they call now as praying or meditating for long periods of time about what you are going to do, because your intent directly reflects spiritually and physically how you complete the task. And if you're not doing it properly, what you do could invoke wrath, because the forces that we're touching don't care if you don't know how to do it. If you don't know how to do it, you shouldn't be doing it.
Yeah.
It's not a game, and it's not something to be played with from, a Dene standpoint. It's very serious. And so I think a lot of these traditions and things are not being carried out because the elders understand that our way of life it just no longer exists. And so rather than poke at these forces like children, it's better to just continue on and let these traditions pass.
And building off on that, the Northern Dene traditional worldview, all things are imbued with some level of life, some level of consciousness. So nothing is separated from that, whether it's the microphones in front of us, the computer, animals, the air around us, weather
Weapons.
forces, everything has that. And so everything has life and consciousness, and everything has access to the power of the universe in differing levels. And so when you're speaking to something and about something, you're calling that power into yourself and you're interacting with it. So there was no concept of discussing something in the abstract. The way we're discussing things right now about copper making, and the traditional ideas about it would not have been possible.
Yeah, and our sort of
in the past,
dry, sitting on the outside, sort of floating above kind of perspective.
So we would have actually had to not been able to really discuss it until we started doing it.
Yeah.
And so that's been part of what's so hard about getting elders to talk about the process too, is on another project I finally articulated this to an elder, and it was very blunt, it was very Dene of me, but I was just like, look, the context in which it's appropriate for you to give me this knowledge will never exist. So I need, even though it feels in G, I need you to tell me about this or it's going to die with you.
Right.
And it was very blunt and it was very upfront, and I felt really guilty about it because it's kind of a mean thing to say, but I'm also just frustrated. I'm almost 30 and I don't understand 90% of my culture because we don't live like that anymore.
Right.
You can't just be like, hey, Uncle Fred, let's go make a copper knife. It will never happen. Most Native children are actually kinesthetic learners, and that's because we don't verbally impart information. We show. So like when I was growing up, I was 8 years old before I cut any moose meat, but I had spent the first 8 years of my life watching my grandmother do it. And they made sure when I was that age that all the kids watched. Like we were always with the adults and the elders especially, and we spent all of our time just watching how they did stuff. And I didn't realize it at the time, but then I went to cut the meat and it was like I'd been doing it my whole life. So everything I know about skinning moose, everything I know about, what's supposed to be sacred has come from us actively partaking in the project. So yeah, it's really hard to get an elder to sit down and be like, tell me how to make a copper knife.
Yeah.
Because no one in the past 2-3 generations ever took them out to make one.
This goes back a little bit, coming full circle to the original question of how long has copper been used.
Yeah.
There's actually two different words for copper in Northern Dene, especially the Alaskan Dene languages. And the first one was fairly descriptive, and it was just almost like what we think of as a noun. Sitha. sa. And it basically means si is rock, and sa is like excrement, so rock excrement. And so yeah, if you think about like raw copper nugget, it kind of looks bulbous and everything, that could look a little bit like excrement. But also, one thing I noticed was that if you've ever been in a berry patch, a blueberry patch, that a bear has gone through recently, and when that happens, bears are eating nothing, black bears especially eating nothing but blueberries. Their scat will take on a very shiny blue-green color. And that is exactly the same color as oxidized copper in natural formation. I mean, it looks identical to it. And so there's a lot of places in interior Alaska and the Copper River area where this copper was just coming out of the ground in nugget form and also in oxidized form. And it's just this beautiful blue-green oxidation all over quartz and stuff like that. And it's exactly the same color. And so the Dene knew they were recognizing copper for a long time, not necessarily using it, but when they started using it, the word changed, chedi, and that means rock that which is being hammered. Mm-hmm. They were actually working with copper nuggets in the Middle East, when people started working with copper, they were actually working with ore first and learning how to melt that down. For the Dene, it was opposite. They were working with actual copper nuggets and hammering that down into a final artifact form. Is
that just a matter of being lucky enough to have raw copper nuggets sort of in the form you need them?
It's speculative, and I think who knows what happened when the first Dene person, found that nugget and started, deciding what to do with it.
I think that presages probably something we'll talk about in a moment, but I wanted to quickly ask one more question to kind of set the stage in people's imagination for this. I guess it's sort of a two-parter. I think they go together. One is, what is like the variety of tools that people made out of copper look like? And was it all tools? Were there also, jewelry and adornments or, sculptures, or like, was it used for artistry at the same time? And then I guess the other piece of it, I think, is, when you talk about this sort of the spiritual, like the gravity of copper working, and that the seriousness of it. I'm curious what copper is sort of associated with. Like, if it's being used for spears and knives, does it have like a sort of an association with death or with violence, or does it have an association with family and legacy? Or what sort of tone does it have as a thing?
That's a really neat question. Owning copper was a big deal. Like, if you had copper, you were rich. And when I say rich, I don't mean monetarily. I mean rich in land, rich in resource, rich in community, because that's how they gauged wealth. Was how much could you provide for your clan, your tribe, your family?
Yeah.
That was how rich you were. And so as far as jewelry, I can't speak to that. I've never heard of it. I do know that we like to get dressed up. My clan especially, like, we were very vain. We like to look our best. And we do that with color. Red was a big deal, and so ochre was always in high demand. For the copper knives, though, the story that I heard from my uncle, I just remember these items were regarded as almost legendary. I don't know how long people would go between lives without seeing one physically. I also don't know if they were common enough that everyone had seen one at some point. But one of the stories that he told me that is always on my mind for some reason is the story of the chief's knife. And he told me this story shortly after telling me about the 2 copper knives we had at our village that he had found in a dig. And the story went, from what I can remember, there was this village who heard about a chief or one of their relatives was going to be made into a leader. And so they were asked to make the chief's knife. And for some reason, the person who was making this knife in the village was like, I can't make this knife case because I don't have the knife. And so the request went down to another village. And they kind of scoffed at that, and they were like, okay, well, we'll make it. And in turn, they were scoffed at. They were like, you don't have the knife. How are you supposed to make the case? You don't know what this knife looks like. And they made the case, and by the time that knife case had made it over to the village where the knife was, the copper knife, it fit perfectly, because the chief's knife is so important that everybody who makes these things understands that it's done in this specific particular way. And so it just so happened that the request first went to somebody who just had no clue. Just no clue about any of this, because everyone else was just like, oh yeah, that's what a chief's knife looks like. And nobody was surprised that it fit the knife.
Yeah.
Because that's just how it's done. But yeah, as far as being used for a bear spear, or anything that you would have to rely on in a moment of like actual danger, I don't know if they did back in the day, but I personally probably wouldn't make a bear spear out of copper. It work hardens, and if you got it down to a very nice little point, probably, but a bear spear, in terms of what we're thinking, like a biface or a projectile point, I could see that snapping or folding or bending.
That's definitely not the moment where you want that.
Yeah, yeah. Or, if you did, I could see wrapping copper in bone or bringing the copper point back to the haft. So that the point was not damaged, but it still had the ability to penetrate and hemorrhage. But it would, in my unpracticed opinion, I don't think going up to a bear and like stabbing it with copper would be very effective.
That's really the next step of our experimentation is
how do we do
waking
this?
Up a bear in hibernation.
Yeah,
we're
what are you doing that?
Waking something up in hibernation. And
So,
but yeah, and then sorry to actually add like more substance to your question. I think when people see copper, they immediately associate it with leadership and everybody knowing that that person provides for their community.
If this goes back at least 1,000 years,
at least that we can prove.
But that's not it started 1,000 years ago. It could have been long before then.
That's when we can say we definitively see this in the record.
Yeah. Are there stories that reference that birth of copper working, whether it was 1,000 years ago or longer?
There might be. Why I say there might be is part of our work with this copper is we're learning that our perspectives are so drastically different fundamentally from Dene 1,000 years ago that when we first hear a story, it's all this acid tripping, high abstract concept. It's like grandmother spider is weaving her silk web to drop children down from the sky. When really that sounds crazy to us, but if you were in Dene context, you would know like this old woman threw a rope down so these kids could climb off a cut bank. That's what that story is talking about. And if you're Dene, that's obvious. If you're me, who is, I'm from the village, I grew up Dene, but I have a Western lexicon.
Yeah.
And so to me, that sounds like just a trip. And so why I say there might be stories about these copper knives is there very well could be. However, we could be not understanding that because of language and concept translation. So, yeah.
I suspect that those stories are known, but not really, haven't really been discussed to the right person. So that'll be research questions for Evie.
Very cool.
Yeah. But we were told by an elder in the Copper River area who was granddaughter of one of the last copper chiefs. The story she told was that Raven brought the first copper knife to the Atna people. And Raven is sort of he's a transformer trickster archetype, and Raven's stories are often tell us how the world is and why it is the way it is. And so tying, when something is tied back to Raven, it's a very fundamental part of one's culture, and something that's considered very ancient, almost mythic in a real high sense.
Maybe now would be a good time to ask you about some of your attempts to reconstruct these methods of smithing and making these knives. I imagine that was a big story of trial and error, right?
Hardcore.
Yeah, so Evie and I talked about this for several years traditionally. So I did a bunch of reading on just whatever bits of information that I could find, and I passed them on to Evie. She had all her stories and stuff. We talked about it a lot, and then finally, I think it was 6 or 7 years ago, we finally stitched together enough money. Neither one of us had, at the time, really had much disposable income, so we were, just getting a few dollars here and there. We finally had enough to pool together to start to build.
So wait, you funded this yourselves, not?
Yeah.
Oh,
wow.
yeah.
No grant. No, there's no
Nothing.
grant
Man.
funding that went into this.
Honestly, I don't. We made a meme about this because it felt like we were just hanging out. Like we were very academically interested in this, but it had nothing to do with our careers.
Yeah.
And
we didn't set out to say, "Hey, let's do a study and
Right.
We're going to do an
publish,"
experimental
and- right.
archaeology
No, this
project and
this was
present
very
at a
organic.
conference. And,
Yeah, it was very it just developed as our friendship continued to
Yeah.
develop and
Yeah.
grow. And so at one point, somebody was like, "Hey, you need to come do a talk on this at this conference," and we were like. They've caught us. The fun is over. This is officially
This is now
research.
work.
So when we talk about this, it becomes very research oriented. It sounds like it's this incredible research project. It never was.
It's all a shame.
Yeah. Yeah, we patched together enough money to put together build a forge. We built one in sort of, I guess we should say, Western style. There's actually no data on what a native forge looked like. And there's people would talk about, copper was just cold hammered, or copper was annealed in heat, but there was no details beyond that. And so we were all just kind of like,
Everyone's kind of shooting in the dark a little bit.
yeah. And
Well,
the
I wonder
methods
how
just
much of it-
didn't make sense to us.
Right. And then, too, I wonder how much of this is just aunts and uncles and grandparents not really knowing and thinking they know and then passing on what they think happened. Because as we discussed, I'll offer my own opinions based on our research as to why I think it was or was not cold hammered. But
Yeah.
two, the only descriptions of anything resembling even close to forging I got from my grandfather and Uncle Fred, and the same hardening and annealing methods you can use for bone and stone also apply to copper,
Oh, interesting.
which I have verified through our practice. But not to cut you off, but that is a thing, is that there's this not huge, among people who do this,
Yeah.
there's this discussion as to whether or not they heat forged at all, and I'm saying, yeah, they had to. There's no way they couldn't have. But anyway, sorry.
Yeah, there was a lot of people were saying, well, the Atna just cold hammered. They would get these copper nuggets.
Yeah.
They would cold hammer them, which basically you're not adding heat to the process. You're just taking a nugget and hammering it flat, which sounds like it will work when you're just speaking in English about it. But problem is,
copper work hardens, and so as you continue to hammer copper, the molecules get closer together. Over time, that will flake. If there are any impurities in that copper, which if you're using it in the form that the
Right, just
ancestors
natural
did,
occurring copper.
it's gonna fall apart all over the place.
Yeah.
To cold hammer an entire knife, I just don't think that's
or even
possible.
an arrowhead, really, yeah.
Yeah, just because there's so much shaping and there's so much... Because I've also had it described to me how to get the impurities out using small amounts of heat and annealing so that the copper doesn't get so hard and flaky that it turns into essentially copper dust and copper bits that are unusable. Because, again, there's a huge difference between smelting, forging, and removing impurities, because they didn't have smelting available to them. I mean, they had no container for it. They had no way to facilitate that.
And just so listeners know what smelting is that a lot of metals don't exist in a pure metallic form in the natural world. They exist as an ore, where it's oxidized, bonded to another metal, and so you have to apply heat and sometimes other chemical means to extract that metal. Here in the Copper River Valley, to actually come out in nuggets, and you can find it just in pure nuggets. And so experimenting and learning how to extract it as an ore didn't need to happen.
Yeah.
Here, so it was very. No, we're lucky in finding it like that.
Because you didn't have to heat it all the way up and melt it and then put it in a mold because you don't have to. That's amazing. That's wonderful. You can kind of soften it up so it's like Play-Doh, and then you work it.
And then you shape it. Yeah.
And the impurities will just come out.
How long does it take? I mean, I assume I would assume it's safe to say that you're still not master copper workers,
not even close.
But is part of the cost or the value in ancient trade networks is it the material itself, like the copper is rare and only comes from this one place and has to be carried a long way, or is it a lot of work to get a nice copper knife made? Does it take a huge amount of time?
So if we were going to go pure traditional and take iron from or copper from a river in ore form and do it, I could see spending an entire day and a half on the process, because you're not just looking at making the knife, you're looking at preparing the fire, preparing yourself.
Yeah.
Making sure there's no kids running around, making sure, aunt or uncle who wants to be part of that process is there. Also, hydration is huge. That's something that blacksmiths never talk about. But if you stand anywhere near a fire, the way you have to when you're just going in and making these knives, you will guzzle water. Like, we're talking gallons. So there's a lot of prep that would go into it.
So there's a lot of cost in terms of time and sweat and energy.
Yeah, and it's not a bad cost at all.
Yeah.
It's definitely not a negative. But I do think that affects the value in them because, as we mentioned, these copper shamans, I'm just speaking as a blacksmith. I have no idea what would go into spiritually preparing myself for that if I were doing it like legit traditional.
The copper extraction points or mines were also owned individually, and this was one of the few.
They were owned individually.
Yeah, so this was one of the few places where individuals in Dene culture actually owned something on land in every sense of what we consider land ownership today. And it was death if you were caught stealing copper from one of those places, and that's very, very interesting because otherwise, ownership of the land was not a traditionally acceptable treatment of the landscape.
Yeah, the objectifying of it wasn't really a concept, because one of the reasons place names are so important is a strong tradition as you're moving across land is to explain to your younger family whose territory is who takes care of what land, and who is allowed to hunt what animals. And that directly corresponds to where those animals are.
Yeah.
Because if I'm standing up on the big hill behind the village and my uncle points to the mountain range and says, over that mountain range, you don't hunt anything unless you ask those people. It's not because they own objectively the land. It's because they take care of that area.
Yeah.
So the fact that they geographically owned this object is very interesting because that's not how they conceptualized the land.
Do you ever think about it's funny in a weird way, by trying to learn partially from scratch, do you have a feeling of sort of walking in the footsteps of some of the early experiments that must have happened? Like when this technology was first developed 1,000 years ago, or even 2,000 years ago or more, I'm sure there must have been a lot of trial and error and experimentation. And do you ever feel like you're kind of an echo of that?
I do, yeah. 1,000 years ago, somebody was doing this, and I actually don't feel like they were at a disadvantage at all. I don't think, and this is all speculation.
Like they weren't having to unlearn.
Yeah, they weren't. They weren't having to unlearn iron, right. For one thing. But then also, when I was talking about like the temperature difference and how you can taste it and feel it in your skin and in your mouth, like you can feel the temperature in your mouth when you breathe, and there's varying degrees, and those are things that I don't often articulate to people. And there are other senses too, like when you walk outside and you smell. There's a huge difference between 10 above and 10 below.
Yeah.
And there's a huge difference to what it does to you physiologically. And a lot of people don't seem to clock that. indigenous crafters do.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's so much that you're doing with the material and how it interacts with the rest of the environment that you don't have control of. You need to be constantly correcting for things like humidity, temperature, heating, cooling. And so when I'm working copper, I'm almost always just sad that I was not able to grow up at the knee of like an uncle who taught me flint knapping.
Mm-hmm.
Or, I didn't grow up watching this for 15 years of my life, because it will take me another 3 to 4 decades to become so instinctually aware of copper and heat and how it works to be at that level. Like, it's going to take decades of just doing it over and over and over until I form that muscle memory. And sometimes it makes me sad, but like, that's generally what I'm thinking about, is like, these guys had so much knowledge about working with their hands and working with fire and heat and the heat that a fire leaves over. Because a lot of those flint knappers, like we as archaeologists hold flint knapping in very high regard, and the bifaces, we find the projectile points, colloquially arrowheads and spear points. Yeah. We put them on a really high shelf. And they deserve to be there, but we also need to understand that at one point, somebody who had just grown up the first 2 decades of his life watched somebody doing this. They watched somebody read the stone. They watched somebody know their tools. And they learned every vein of that material. So the fact that they could make these things is incredible, but to that person, it was almost like swimming.
Right.
It was almost like breathing. So on one hand, this is incredible. It's an amazing, incredible skill. But on the other, when you're living as a Dene person, it's what you do. It's like walking and running. And so that takes up a large portion of my mind while we're doing this.
One thing that also really has struck me is how much of a community effort it is. This isn't something that Evie or I could go out and just do by ourselves. Even working with a knife, like, the two of us can do this together, and that's a minimum. It would really be a pain to try to do this by myself, or for Evie to do it by herself. And we have a little bit of technology that helps us. We try to do it as much by hand as possible. But I think sometimes we have like a third person just around just to run little menial tasks here and there, which makes it even easier. I imagine that there was several people that were helping blow on the fire to get it hot. Definitely we're using charcoal, and whether they were just collecting that passively from burned trees or producing that, using charcoal to make a fire, you're not losing excess heat to steam waste. So if you can use green wood, sap, wood that's very wet to build a fire, and eventually the fire will burn, but you're losing like a tremendous amount of heat that just gets sucked up into the steam, translating that water into fire or into steam. And so when you use charcoal instead, all that heat is just radiating out into infrared radiation, and so it's very much more efficient way, but you still have to blow the fire hotter. And this is something we have no oral history about, at least that Evie or I have heard, but I suspect there was several people with bone straws that were actively blowing on those hearths when needed, when that copper went back in to heat that metal real quick. I appreciate that a lot more, just the number of people that actually went in to create these implements. It was definitely like...
Right, not really just like a casual, okay, I'm going to go make this on my own kind of a thing, but a little bit of an event, sort of.
Yeah. And it probably lasted until the object was finished. It wasn't something like, hey, come back next week and we'll finish this project. That's something that we have noticed, is that once we start, it's much easier to just go until the knife is done, rather than trying to come back and get everything heated up and going again. It's a real process.
Takes a lot of energy.
Yeah.
Energy in the way of like manpower and, fuel energy.
Time.
Because too, I'm glad you brought up the bellows, because that relates back to your question earlier about how long did it take, and that's part of the prep I was thinking about, is like, how long is it going to take to find 3 or 4 people that aren't going to pass out? after a half hour just blowing on this fire.
Right.
And then too, like, I also wonder about whether or not they needed bellows, because in my early experimental days as a young teenager with this, is I learned that you can actually direct heat really easily in fires you make. And I don't know if you've seen, but the way you set wood to burn, if your fire's already going, like, you can take logs and wall it off inside. You can also arrange coals so that you're actively directing the heat and you're actively directing what burns and when. And so I'm wondering if they didn't do that in lieu of having people come to man at bellows, because it takes a lot less energy to just move around and, burn your face a bit than it does to have a bunch of people hanging out.
So yeah, these are the questions that Evie and I start discussing when we really get into this, and then it reaches sort of a critical mass point where we're like, all right, let's go outside.
Yeah, we gotta do this.
We gotta test this out.
I'm actually looking forward to relining my forge here very shortly.
Yeah, forges don't last forever, and the ones that we built, let's see, I think we got 10 knives out of it. By the end of it, and now we have to rebuild everything.
I'm trying to think of a good closing question. I usually ask something about like recommended readings for people who are interested in learning more. I'm not sure if that's I talk a little bit in one of the chapters in the book
Gift
about
of the Middle Tannenhof.
Yeah, about our work, our experimental work on that. Otherwise. Look into Dr. Corey Cooper's work. He's published a lot of papers on native Otna copper use. Your listeners will have to do their own research on that.
I'm going to be doing some research myself. This got me really excited to learn more about it. Well, thanks for taking the time. Absolutely. I really appreciate it.
Yeah,
this was super cool.
Yeah, I love talking about copper, so this isn't out of the way at all. Nobody ever wants to hear about it, is the problem.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Tell. Until next time. Hey everybody. If you enjoyed the podcast and you want to help me talk to more people in more places, please consider donating. You can do so on my Patreon as a recurring donor, as well as on my website if you'd rather do a one-time donation. The links are patreon.com/Sebastian Weatherby and www.sebastianweatherby.com. Show notes are also available on my website, where you can find citations and comments and other relevant information about the things we talked about today. Thanks again for listening.